This is the fourth of five talks that we've had this semester from the Global Language-Based Area Studies research theme. There are a lot of talks this semester because there won't be any in the second semester when I, unfortunately, will have to go on sabbatical. This talk will be recorded, as you've just seen. We will switch our cameras off. Joey may keep his on. There will be a questionnaire at the end, which you may want to fill in. And there will be one more talk. It's about why France failed in its intervention militarily in Mali. And that will be Professor Tony Chafer, Wednesday of next week at the same time, in person in AIMLANG 2.22. And with that, I'll hand over to Joey, who's going to introduce today's speaker.
Thank you very much, Gordon. So yeah, it's a great pleasure to me, for me to introduce Professor Sarah Bowskill, who is, whose bio I've just lost as finding out. Who, in addition to being our external examiner, is Professor of Latin American Studies at Queen's University Belfast. She moved to Belfast in 2011 following her first academic appointment at Swansea University, so she has fond memories of time spent in Cardiff and South Wales. She specialises in Latin American literature with a particular emphasis on Mexico and women's writing. She's the author of the recently published monograph entitled The Politics of Literary Prestige, Prizes and Latin American Authors, and the volume The Multimedia Works of Contemporary Latin American Women Writers and Artists, which she co-edited with Jane Lavery. This paper is part of an ongoing project about the politics of literature that portray femicide, narco-trafficking and disappearance in Mexico. So yeah, without further ado, over to you, Sarah.
Thanks very much to Joey, and also to Gordon and Rosie for your kind introduction and for the work that you've done organising the event. So in my paper today, I want to talk about this idea that I've been working on, trying to understand political significance of texts, drawing on the work of French political philosopher Jacques Rancière. So as Joey mentioned, I've long been interested in this relationship between literature and politics. And I've been thinking particularly about the political impact, or the potential political impact, of texts about feminicide, narco-trafficking and disappearance in Mexico. Now, there are plenty of examples of such texts, but today I will just talk about two of them, which I think are quite well known. They are Part 4, La Parte de los Crímenes of 2666 by Roberto Bolaño, and Yuri Herrera's novel, Trajos del Reino. And I didn't know this before I started writing this paper, but they were both published in the same year, so that's a very pleasant coincidence. La Parte de los Crímenes is primarily about feminicide, whereas Trajos del Reino is focused on narco-trafficking. But I think that both are doing similar things. Now, when I say doing similar things, it's not a very elegant turn of phrase, but I am thinking of the words of the critic Marc Angenot, who suggests that we should reformulate this question that we always ask ourselves, what is literature? To think instead about what does literature do? What does it work on? What does it know? And particularly, what does it know better than other knowledge domains? Once we start to consider that literature might know something different to other forms of writing, then we can see fiction, as Rancière does, not as the invention of imaginary worlds which stand in opposition to the solid realities of action, but as a structure of rationality, a mode of presentation that renders things, situations, or events perceptible and intelligible. So it's this way in which literature can render things perceptible and intelligible in new ways that I hope to focus on here, because Rancière argues politics happens when things are perceived in new ways, or in his terminology, when the distribution of the sensible is changed. I should note here that the translations of Rancière's terminology in French vary. So sometimes you get the distribution of the perceptible and sometimes distribution of the sensible, but the meaning from the French is the same. So Rancière argues that political activity reconfigures the distribution of the perceptible. It introduces new objects and subjects onto the common stage. It makes visible what was invisible. It makes audible as speaking beings those who were previously heard as noisy animals. And perhaps the clearest example he gives of how politics changes the distribution of the sensible is that of a political protest, where a group which is not part of the community occupies a public space in order to be seen and heard. When it comes to the politics of literature, then, Rancière writes that the politics of literature implies that literature intervenes in this carving up of space and time, the visible and the indivisible, speech and noise. It intervenes in the relationship between practices and forms of visibility and modes of saying that carves up one or more common contexts. And it's from this understanding of what the politics of literature might mean, changing perceptions of time and space, who can go where, who is and is not visible, who can and cannot speak, that I seek to derive a way of analysing literary texts. Now, I need to introduce a note of caution because there is some critical debate around these novels and around the usefulness of Rancière's work. So on the one hand, writing about 2666, we have the work of Elisa Cabrera Garcia and Michael Kraus-Franzen. Now, Cabrera Garcia models her approach to 2666 on Rancière's approach to the work of Flaubert, Mallarmé, Brecht, and Borges, although in this instance, Rancière isn't interested in the politics of those texts particularly. She argues that that 2666 is the literary representation of different types of feminicide that were outlined in the work of Graciela Atencio and others, and concludes that the form of the text makes gender inequality and the crimes of the feminicide visible, particularly talking about the fragmentation of the text. Kraus-Franzen also sees form as being at the heart of the novel's political project, identifying its forensic aesthetics as being the key to this. He concludes that the novel is political because it makes the dead women visible, literally making them count by highlighting that they did not count before in society. And that's why he argues you have the sort of multiple descriptions of the discovery of the bodies. On the other hand, this time writing about Trabajos del Reino, one of the leading critics of Mexico's narconovela genre, Osvaldo Zavala, has used Rancière's work to argue that the options for fictional representations of narco-trafficking are pre-established via hegemonic discourses. So for him, fiction about the drug trade can only replicate the existing distribution of the sensible. It can't have any, it can't affect any political change. I contend, however, that this position ignores Rancière's own suggestion that fiction could cause a redistribution of the sensible, if only in these very specific ways that I've outlined. Faced with this critical impasse, what I propose is to try to use Rancière in a more systematic way, a way that's attentive to content more than form, and a way that starts with the text rather than reality. Potentially, the result is that the approach could be applied to a wider range of texts to understand whether they're intervening in politics. So let's start with 2666. Focusing on how it changes understandings of time and space and who can and cannot go where. It's clear from this image from Bolaño's archive that he thought in detail about the representation of space in this part of the novel. This image is taken from one of Bolaño's notebooks exhibited as part of an exhibition at the CCCB in Barcelona, and the image is labelled as being a map of Santa Teresa. It's therefore no coincidence that every time a body is found, the narrator gives a detailed description of the location, so that a map of the city begins to emerge in the reader's mind. Yet the police almost completely overlook the significance of space and fail to connect cases even when the bodies are found in the same location. The importance of space for understanding the killings is underlined by former FBI investigator Albert Kessler, who visits the locations where bodies are found and reports Walking through these streets in broad daylight is scary, he told the press. I mean, it's scary for a man like me. At night, for a woman, it's dangerous, said Kessler. The majority of streets, except the main thoroughfares where the buses go, have insufficient or no lighting. Kessler's comments make clear that the women are made vulnerable because of the geography of the city. The urban environment, lacking basic infrastructure, conspires against them and puts them at risk. Space is thus revealed as a contributory factor in their deaths. Even when the women do step into the public sphere, it's difficult for them to move around the city. The buses that take them to work leave them far from the factory gates, and they have to walk along dirt tracks to get to the final destination. The relative immobility of the women is contrasted with the killer's mobility. Eventually, investigating the case of Estrella Ruiz Sandoval, Epifanio realizes that the culprit must have a car. And Juan de Dios Martinez starts to connect some of the cases when he too notices the significance of the road and transport. He concludes the killer or killers must have arrived by car, taken her out of the boot, and thrown her body at the side of the road. This apparent breakthrough, however, is never followed up, yet the reader is in no doubt that movement is key to understanding the crimes. Transport and movement also provide the link between the cartels and the killers in the novel. Both are highly mobile and can move bodies around the city without raising suspicions. Men connected to cartel boss Estanislao Campuzano own transport companies and have connections to the maquiladoras, which are served by their waste disposal trucks. By drawing attention to the locations in which the dead bodies are found and to who can and cannot move around the city, 2666 thus points to, without naming the perpetrators of the many crimes in Santa Teresa. Trabajos del Reino tells the story of the musician Lobo as he enters the kingdom. The novel is based around an analogy between the world of a feudal kingdom and the world of a drugs cartel. The rule of the cartels is shown to replace democracy, with kings and feudal laws battling to conquer new territory. Trabajos makes no specific reference to location, and events do not expressly take place in the present. Instead, the novel challenges the perception that any narco-occupied state can be modern, inviting comparisons between narco-states and medieval kingdoms. At the start of the novel, the kingdom has recently popped up in a forgotten wasteland, offering new opportunities. And the following description is from the first time that Lobo, the main character, goes to the palace, highlighting the transformation that's occurred in the space due to the arrival of the kingdom, and contrasts the surrounding town with the luxury of the palace. He'd been out this way a long time ago, when he's still with his parents, but back then it was a dump, a hellhole of waste and infection. No way to know it would become a beacon. The royalty of a king determined these things. The man had settled among simple folk and turned the filth to splendor. Approached from afar, the palace exploded from the edge of the desert in a vast pageantry of gardens, gates, and walls. A gleaming city on the fringes of a city in squalor, a city that seemed to reproduce its misfortune on street after street. The kingdom is physically cut off from the community and guarded to keep unwanted visitors away, but the king allows people in when they can be of service to him. The jeweler attends the king's court, and so does Lobo, at which point he becomes the artist who will compose corridos, songs from the north of Mexico, for the king. Once a month, the king holds an open court where people come to ask for his help. The community is thus shown to be dependent on the palace in the absence of other social structures. And it's precisely the way in which the cartel steps in to fill the void in this literal wasteland left by the absent state that Trabajos makes visible. Once inside the kingdom, Lobo discovers the privilege of being able to move around freely, observing what's going on unnoticed due to his lowly status. We're told the artist realized that people only paid attention to him when they wanted someone to listen to how macho they were, and that was a good thing, because it meant that he could understand the comings and goings of the court. Like a cat in a house that doesn't belong to it, bit by bit he started adventuring beyond the dining room and the girls' room. So as not to feel overwhelmed by the grandeur of the palace, the artist got into the habit of carrying around a mirror and looking at all the little details of things over his shoulder. In this way, too, he could observe without being seen the visits of the townspeople, the people in suits, carrying briefcases, police looking for Jews, the never-ending business. It was like being invisible. By showing how Lobo, as the artist, moves around the palace unnoticed, yet be the only person who perceives the truth and complexity of what's going on, Trabajos draws attention to itself as a text that knows something that other texts do not, and to the role of the cultural producers as key witnesses with special insight. La parte de los crímenes begins with the sentence, the dead woman appeared in the wasteland in the Las Flores neighborhood. The verb to appear, or aparecer in Spanish, is subsequently used over and over again in relation to the women's bodies, which seemingly appear out of nowhere. The verb underlines the way in which, in the eyes of societies and the authority, these women only begin to exist at the moment of their deaths, when their violated, brutalized bodies break into the public sphere and public consciousness. The novel also makes visible the ineffective police investigations which allow evidence to go missing and suspects to disappear simply by leaving town, and almost overwhelms the reader with the forensic reports, making the violent nature of the crimes painfully visible. In the feudal society of Trabajos del Reino, the state is conspicuous by its absence. As Paz Soldan writes, more than a failed state, what we have here is an absent state. That said, the novel also makes visible the way in which the instruments of the state, the police and the army, collaborate with the cartel. At the end of the novel, it is the army that moves in and endorses the heir as the replacement for the king. In so doing, the novel hints at the hidden role of state actors in popping up and perpetuating the cartels. Trabajos is also noteworthy for making marginalized figures such as Lobo visible. Abandoned by his mother and father, he earns money playing the accordion in bars and lives on the street waiting for a miracle to happen that might change his life. This miracle comes in the form of the cartel. For Lobo, like other people who seek help from the cartel, they've been invisible to the state for so long that they're easily taken in by what the cartel can offer. According to Acosta, Trabajos thus becomes part of a political discourse based on the point of view of inadequately represented political subjects. In search of representation, these subjects turn to the cartels, who at least acknowledge their existence. However, by naming the characters according to their function, the jeweler, the journalist, and so on, Trabajos also alerts us to the way in which the cartel is not interested in individuals, only in the functions they provide in the service of the cartel. This means that on entering the palace, Lobo loses his name and becomes only the artist. And it's only when he leaves the service of the king at the end of the novel that he recovers his name and identity. So the novels also change who can speak and what can and cannot be said. Early in part 4, a priest whose church was attacked by the criminal known as El Penitente tells us, the Mexico City journalist Sergio Gonzalez, that they should open their eyes. The man who profanes the churches, who is now a killer, is not the biggest scourge in this city. At their second meeting, the priest repeats the assertion that the crimes against women represent a more pressing issue. Opening one's eyes, then, is presented as being key to solving the crimes. Many characters choose to not open their eyes, and fewer, including the narrator, will say anything explicitly. And in this way, the novel draws attention to the culture of silence around the killings. Klaus Haas, a man falsely accused of some of the murders, expresses his disbelief when he's in prison and several gang members are killed in front of many witnesses and no one says anything. He says to his lawyer, but if they know, why don't they say? Because people are discreet, Klaus, said the lawyer. Journalists too, they're the most discreet of all, says the lawyer. In this climate of fear, where silence is for sale, understanding the crimes of part 4 relies more on implied comparisons and the piecing together of information than on explicit statements about who is responsible. Another common thread emerges as a result of the femicides being placed alongside the El Penitente case. The director of the asylum, Elvira Campos, explains that El Penitente urinates in churches because he's afraid of sacred objects, which is a fear known as sacrophobia. She lists other common fears, including gynophobia, which is a fear of women. Campos explains that this fear is widespread in Mexico to the extent that people are afraid to even acknowledge that it exists. Gynophobia is not articulated as the cause of any one crime, but it's placed in the mind of the reader to draw their own conclusions, having read the descriptions of the femicides. Another fear named by Campos, not coincidentally I suggest, is verbophobia, a fear of words. She says this is a complex phobia because words are everywhere, even in the silence, which is never really a total silence. The way in which the novel invites comparison, placing different crimes alongside one another, is a perfect illustration of how silence is never complete. Nothing is said, but much is implied, and can be understood from the way in which the fragments are arranged. Indeed, silence is perhaps more effective than the declarations made by seemingly unreliable characters, such as the accused killer Klaus Haas and the clairvoyant Florita Almada. Although the novel does not allow new voices to come to the fore, the women cannot speak because they are dead, it does expose the conspiracy of silence, which allows the feminicides to continue. Thinking about who can and cannot speak in Trajos, we learn that Lobo grew up in a flimsy house where no one spoke a word. Yet he comes to realize the full power of his words when he writes songs for the king. The only difference between one cartel boss and another is Lobo, because through his songs, Lobo shapes the perceptions, making the king more powerful than his rival. The character of Lobo thus alerts us to the power of words and the ways in which cultural producers can be co-opted by the cartels in what could be considered a cautionary tale for producers of narco corridos, whose works have been accused of glamorizing the cartels. The fact that the king is able to harness even temporarily the discursive power the artist represents is a significant achievement. The question of who can speak and what can be said is thus seen as being of utmost importance, because controlling the narrative means controlling the kingdom. The media, represented by the character of the journalist, is also complicit in using words to prop up the power of the cartel. But this activity is not without risk, and the journalist pays with his life. We learn that, to entertain the fools with clean lies, the journalist had to make them seem true. The real news was in Lobo's domain, material for the corridos, and there were so many of them that he could easily forget those that didn't serve the king. The greater truth, we're told, is to be found in the supposedly fictional text. As much as changing who can and cannot speak and what can be said, the novel therefore cautions us about the power of words and how this power can be abused. Now, working very briefly through these two examples, I've hoped to have shown that Rancière's definition of what politics does provides a framework that we can use to answer questions about the politics of literature. Literature may be political if it can be interpreted as changing understandings of time, space, and movement, of who can and cannot go where, if it can change who is visible, who can speak, and what can be said. So 2666 changes our understanding of space and movement, presenting them as causes of feminicide and not just as context. It makes the murdered women visible in the moment of death, underscoring their previous invisibility. And finally, it reproduces the culture of silence to reveal that it's the fact that so much cannot be said that allows the crimes to continue. Trajos del Reino connects the world of the present-day cartel with that of the feudal kingdom, making visible the absent state and the people it has failed. It's a ringing endorsement of the power of the spoken word, presenting a clear argument for turning to fiction for truth. But Rancière warns us that there are no guarantees as to how any reader might respond to a text. Some may experience this change in understanding and some may not. And it may be at this point that the literary critic comes into play. We are not neutral observers of the texts that we read, and Rancière argues that we should challenge the opposition between viewing and acting, which for our purposes can be recast as challenging the opposition between reading and writing. we should recognize that the researcher, as much as the author or artist, produces meaning through the connections that they make. Our criticisms produce readings which have the potential to create or make political readings visible or not. So if we want to answer the question of what can literature do, we perhaps also need to think about what critics do and what we can do. Thank you very much for listening.
Thanks very much, Sarah. Yeah, it was a real pleasure. Also to hear a talk about two books that I've actually read, which is great. And a really a really interesting explanation of Rancière as well. And I sort of, it's a name that you hear quite a lot, but I haven't read Rancière. But yeah, very, very stimulating. I don't know. Does anybody have any questions they want to kick us off with? I mean, if not, then I suppose you're writing kind of against Savala, aren't you? And his sort of polemical, the only way is to reproduce, all that culture can ever do is reproduce, the political logics that are already out there. I suppose, I don't know, it reminded me of John Kraniauskas, who's done, work on this. I'm sure you've maybe seen him talk about it. One of his lines was that basically narco culture, like all narco culture, is part of the narco drug war, like narco cultura. And by he was kind of isn't saying the same thing as Savala exactly, but sort of saying we are participating in it. As well as critics, because we're sort of in it, very indirectly, but we're also kind of making our living from the drug war if we write about this stuff, which is kind of obviously kind of a provocation as well, but it's sort of true in a way. I don't know. I feel like I'm rambling a little bit, but I suppose my own work, I've ended up kind of finding myself, I don't know, just kind of sort of deciding or sort of ending up thinking that my task as a critic is to decide what examples are complicit in narcocultura and which are not. And I suppose, the sort of Bolaño and Herrera are both, I guess, critics who are very much trying to write not in a narcocultura kind of a way, aren't they? Or writers rather, not critics. But yeah, I suppose my question maybe is, do you see that there as being, do you see that kind of continuity between narcocultura and these novels, or do you see a hard kind of...
No, I absolutely do. I think in thinking about what we should and shouldn't be doing as critics, sort of Rancière's idea talks about you placing things alongside each other which are unexpected, perhaps. So this paper is actually not a great example of that, although I do combine femicide and narco-trafficking, which are often things that there's some sort of line drawn between the texts about those two topics. But what I'm doing in the broader project is looking at sort of the whole range of cultural production, written cultural production, about the femicides and the narco-trafficking. So everything from sort of popular fiction, which stays very much within sort of the generic boundaries of detective fiction, to graphic novels, and seeing them all together as all contributing to the discussion. And in some cases, perhaps they're not saying things that are so surprising. So you see the repetition of the way they're thinking about space and time and movement, and then others where you see the difference. And I think that rather than sort of trying to say in that sort of very traditional academic way of these are the good texts and we're going to look at those, and these are the bad ones, and these are the ones that are complicit with narcocultura, and these are the ones that are countering the discourse, to try to put them all together is where the sort of potentially interesting thing is, and is also in keeping with Rancière's thinking about looking across the thing, and that the role of the critic is to encourage those comparisons, to create a surface, what he calls a surface, where you can make new things visible through putting the unexpected things together.
I was going to say thank you so much for that. I have a question in the Q&A from Alejandra. So I'm going to read it to you and then you can answer. Yeah, fab. So she says, "Hi, my name is Alejandra and I really enjoyed your lecture. I am Mexican and I was interested in this talk since you are talking about an ongoing critical event that we are battling right now in my home country. I think it is important to bring up this subject. In your opinion, what was the hardest part of this research? Did you have any thoughts from a female perspective?"
The hardest part of the research was, well, part of it is thinking about the corpus, because it's a vast corpus of literature that's now dealing with these subjects in Mexico. And I think that in itself is hugely significant, that this sort of body of work is really taking over the discussion of topics in Mexican literature in many ways. And then it was finding a way to think about them. So finding that the theoretical framework was a challenge, and happened quite by chance through a reading group that was organized with some colleagues. And I guess as a woman, who has a huge amount of privilege and a position to speak to students and to other people about the experiences of other women and other cultures, then I guess that I do feel that responsibility, but also that sense of opportunity to start a discussion and to contribute to a discussion, because I certainly didn't start it.
And actually, if I may take this chance to follow on from Alejandra's question, I was wondering why you went, you say that the two novels you discuss are just two from a much larger group, but I was wondering why, in terms of the philosopher you chose, you went with someone from outside of the region, so someone from France, and why you went with someone male, because I know there's a lot of women. I know Rosalinda Fregoso, who writes about it, Rita Segato as well, and I just wondered how you kind of, if you brought their contributions into what you did, and why you chose Rancière.
So I mean, lots of critics and thinkers have grappled with the question of the role of politics, the relationship between politics in literature, and I mean that it is a tradition certainly that has been dominated by sort of Western European perspectives and male perspectives as well, and also, interestingly enough, sort of perspectives that aren't always coming from a literary context. So Rancière, is a political philosopher who felt no problem at all wandering into the question of literature and politics. But I think I did just feel in the end that was a framework that was different to the ones that I'd seen used before, and where I saw potential. But that's certainly not to say that the work of Segato and others doesn't also have a contribution to make. But I mean, Segato in particular isn't seeking to answer the question of the politics of literature, for example. So it was a sort of that specific question that I was trying to answer that Rancière seemed to provide a way into, that didn't rely on sort of making these comparisons between, oh, this is what really happened, this is what's real, and then going to the novel. It allows you to go to the novel to say, well, what happens if we look at these aspects of the text? What does it turn out that the text is telling us about itself almost, and then relying on what we perhaps previously knew or thought to see whether it's having a political implication, rather than comparing it back to the actual context. So I guess it seemed the most useful and relevant, but clearly, I recognize the issues of bringing in critics to understand Latin American literature that aren't from Latin America, and also, male critics commenting on, well, in this case, writing by men, but in other cases, it will be a sort of male philosopher commenting on texts by women authors, mediated by me.
Can I perhaps just ask a quick question myself? I see that Alejandra has actually replied to your comments as well, so we can read those out later. But when I as a non-literary person, the political and literature, it made me think of the whole censorship of books, especially, if you like, under authoritarian regimes where there is messaging going on in the books which is either hidden or not hidden, and I wondered whether there's quite a bit of that going on here. Obviously, if just looking at the date of one of the books, it's it's kind of way in the future, and the other one's in some remote kingdom, so it can't possibly be directly criticizing the cartels with naming names and so on. And I wonder if there's an element of all this kind of messaging going on, but at the same time a bit of fear on the part of the writer not to get too close in some of the descriptions or whatever. And I just wonder as well, if these novels are political, what is the reception of the novel? Are they received through a kind of political prism, or are they received as works of fiction purely?
So these two texts specifically have been very well received by sort of the critical establishment. That they are, in many ways, sort of the most critically acclaimed examples of the text that I'm talking about. Bolaño, when he published, he'd already passed away when he published this, but when he was working on this, he was working primarily in Spain already, so the risks to him were certainly not immediate. And Joey, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Herrera as well was already in California at the point he was writing. So I don't think that we're dealing with writers under regimes that could pose physical threat to them when the texts are published. I think that these are writers that are interested in the power of the indirect communication, that even when these texts had been written, there had already been other texts, such as Arturo Pérez Reverte's narco novel, which had dealt in much more explicit and direct ways with narco-trafficking, for example, and had been very successful in Mexico already. Bolaño wasn't the first person to write about the femicides, so I think what they were doing was trying to approach these issues in a different way, possibly to create a different political consciousness. So I think that in that sense, their choices to do with artistic decisions and aesthetic decisions to have the political impact, rather than with any kind of issues around censorship.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, it is a very interesting question. The sort of reception and why these two novels and a couple of others really did cut through internationally and shed so much light and so much attention onto these questions. I think my colleagues will be bored of me going on about this, but one of the books I've recently sort of been able to fund through this grant is about testimonies of by families of people who've been disappeared, not necessarily women, but I guess in some cases. And that's produced by like a tiny little grassroots group, and it's very personal, like terrible stories. But in terms of the question of what it's going to do as a text, it can never have the kind of reach of these novels. And has a very different sort of relationship to the reality that I'm sort of still trying to work out kind of what to do with in terms of my own research or whatever.
I think that that question of why some novels are successful and some aren't comes into like the other angle of my research, which looks at the structural issue. I mean, Bolaño is successful because he gets in with the right publisher in Spain. Carlos Barral, the very famous sort of Spanish publisher, takes on his cause, if you like, and it snowballs from there. So I think that whilst there certainly is something very interesting about these two texts, which probably appeals to sort of the world literature type audience and agenda, there's also like the whole structural side to why these particular texts become successful, because of the positions of privilege that the authors were already enjoying to some extent. Have you seen so the broader project, which includes the text about disappearance? I look at Brenda Navarro's Casas Vacías, which is probably one of the texts that is really starting to cut through, which is about disappearance.
No, I'm not. Thanks for that. Yeah. I see we've got another question in the chat. I don't know if that's
I was just going to. So first of all, Alejandro says, very interesting response. It is definitely a challenging subject. In my opinion, from a local perspective, I believe there is much more information that does not come out to light as it is hidden with blood through violence, which is a bit sad because literary works can only take us so far. Politics are always a nasty, censored subject. Thank you very much for your well-thought response. And then Jenny says, thanks, Sarah, a very interesting talk. I missed a little bit at the beginning. The sense that literature is able to say things or know things better than other writing definitely resonates. Are we ever able to decant this effectively? And then she says, also as a non-literary person, just as in brackets there.
I'm not quite sure what you mean by decant, Jenny. I think certainly, the quotation sort of is sort of saying, that literature can do things that other texts can't. And one thing that I find interesting is that, even though there have been a lot of sort of newspaper reports, the Amnesty International report about the femicides in Mexico, lots of films about narco-trafficking, for example, documentaries and so on, that there still seems to be this urge to produce writing about these issues, and writing that goes from the examples today right through to sort of self-published stuff where the drug lords are vampires, and they sort of turn this the sort of whole thing into a vampire novel where, with the metaphor that the cartels are sucking the blood from society. I mean, it's not great, but clearly someone felt that there was a literary response to be made there, and I think that's sort of what's interesting, that on the one hand these issues are provoking a literary response, but there are also ways of saying things that literature can use that non-fiction forms particularly can't.
And actually, based on that question, I was wondering, because you talk about, for example, in the 2666 example about the relevance of space in femicide, and one of the things you said was how poorly lit, these kind of long walks down poorly lit roads is one of the main, not so much context, but actually a contributing factor. And I was wondering, if in writing that, he's actually trying to change something, and that's how literature and politics are interacting, is that he's actually using literature to actively try and make a change, because, you know, adding some street lighting is not a huge step to take, but it could potentially, you know, be a partial solution.
I mean, I guess that's sort of the next stage afterwards that he may or may not envisaged. So literature, I think it would be quite a stretch to say literature can lead to the introduction of street lighting. I mean, that seems like such a huge leap. But literature maybe can change our understanding of space and the role of space in the murders. And then I guess maybe as a sort of second, third remove from that, someone with the power to change access to space, change physical space, could put in the street lighting. But I think that's the leap where literary criticism tends to get into trouble, where it sort of says reading this book will make people put streetlights outside, or the opposite, you know, reading this book will or watching this film usually, or playing this video game will make people violent. I think that what putting the sort of this type of reading in between allows us to think a bit more subtly about how you get between sort of that extreme of reading the text and real world action, maybe.
Sarah, I'm conscious that we've got about 5 minutes, and there are some other people who haven't had the chance to ask questions, so please do put your questions in the chat. I'm just going to squeeze one question in myself, which is, you mentioned, I think it was Grancière or somebody, who says that interpretation as a critic or whatever is over to the individual, and it can be interpreted in many different ways. So is there any danger that any of these texts could be interpreted the wrong way? In other words, people say, well, actually, this is a good thing. You know, I'm thinking back to my own career, Les Moralistes. Well, what was that? That wasn't really advocating pedophilia or whatever, but it could be interpreted as such. So is there a danger of misinterpretation?
So from Rancière's point of view, that would absolutely be a possibility, that you can't guarantee how any one reader would ever respond to a text. But then sort of I didn't get to mention it, you know, I sort of put in the caveat about Stanley Fish, you know, talking about interpretive communities and how actually, you know, readers who are broadly from similar cultural backgrounds and so on are likely to interpret the text in similar ways. But yeah, absolutely, Rancière is very clear that there are no guarantees in this. So yeah, there are no guarantees. But as critics, I guess, by sort of thinking, almost by reinforcing some of the ideas, by bringing ideas from the novel that we see to the fore, then you can sort of help to consolidate certain interpretations, which is, I think, in fact, what happens. You know, you see striking similarities in terms of the way people think about these texts, in that people tend to think particularly that these two are doing something political, even if they can't quite say what and how. Whereas with the sort of popular fiction examples, the criticism tends to go along the lines of, oh, it's just sort of opportunistic exploitation for the profit of the author.
Yeah, that's a really good answer. I'm thinking actually about a totally different domain, but Hollywood movies, they never leave any scope for ambiguity. You know, who are the good guys, the bad guys, there's never any ambiguity. But I'm guessing in these texts there probably is a degree of scope for ambiguity.